Hello, my name is Audrey Kurabugo, and this is a farewell message to a friend of mine, the late Right Honorable Jacob Oulanyah, a thinker, a good man with a sense of originality, and a level-headed gentleman. It was early October 1990, and we had just picked our brown envelopes, having checked our names on the notes boards at Makerere University main building, where those names were printed on large paper with a stencil and a typewriter, equipment of those days, 30-something years ago. For some of us who had come from rural schools and had very limited educational facilities when we were secondary or primary, we had finally made it to Makerere University, and this was one of our best moments. Now, so therefore, the crowding and the craning around the notes boards was intense. Many of us sweating and trying to see who is here. Many of us strangers trying to see if there was anyone from one's area or former school. And if one was resident or non-resident, like me, I was a non-resident who ended up staying in the hall. The meeting around the hall, the main hall, filled us with a certain measure of excitement as well as curiosity, because we wanted to know what would portend for us in this quote-unquote wider world, since we had come from villages, given it had been the first step out of those villages. As we did all that, the air was filled with a taste of bitter rivalry between what we had found as two contending university factions in previously concluded guild elections. Pitted two candidates, one called Norbert Mao, who had emerged winner, and one called Noble Mayombo, who would pass away in 2007. Noble had lost by a narrow margin. For us who had just joined, seemed to signify a dying era of some UPC symbolism, because UPC had been government till around July of 1985. Symbolism for a dying UPC and symbols of an incoming, not yet well understood NRM. That's what we picked. In many ways, the race was a sign of the times, bringing up underlying but very unmistakable fears, and some of those fears largely stereotypical, that divided the country at the time. One of these stereotypical positions was that for the first time, there was an army officer hailing from Kabalole district, standing against a refractory student leader from Gulu, and they had locked horns over leadership, as if Gulu and Kabalole, one was Iceland and another one Norway. These are in the country, but stereotypes of the time promoted these. The language alone was divisive. Now, for many of us, one camp represented the new order of no-party politics, and the other camp represented a temporarily dying order of multi-party politics at the time. Norbert Mao had allied with another candidate called Charles Vuba. Remember, I think that was the name. This alliance, Noble and his people had termed it an alliance only comparable in terms and proportion to the 1962 KY-UPC alliance to defeat Benedicto Kiwanuka. How so strange the world is. Strange irony that Norbert Mao would, some 20 years later, lead the Democratic Party as the first leader from Gulu to do that. In a few days of my joining university, curiosity and the love of debates got the better part of me, because I wouldn't stay in one place. I wanted to hear what was going on. So one evening, I went to the main hall, and I watched at 8 p.m. in the evening a guild representative council session. We used to call them GRC sessions. I watched for the first time, and there, seated right at the back of that little hall in Makerere, which used to look big when you were young, who was warming up to the villain camp of Mayombo, who had lost, I was struck by this young, tall, dark orator, who, whenever he took to the floor, spoke as if his nose was a little pressed for air, and he had this very rhythmic flow of words that one would simply want to listen to him more and more and more. It was Jacob Oulanyah. He had, even then as a young man, a very developed command of oratory for his age. And even though he was Speaker of the GRC and needed to show impartiality, whenever he took to the floor, he would mercilessly cut the other side to size in order for him to make a point. It is partly this Jacob's grandiloquence, or high sense of oratory, that drove students into the strike on December 10th, 1990, over the scrapping of student allowances. We used to call them boom. Now, police shot at us and killed 2 Thomases, Thomas Okema and Thomas Onyango. Now, for some of us who were opposed to this strike, our side mobilized students in the night to march and sing through the night, through the roads at university, through the Freedom Square, protesting the strike and denouncing strike leaders and asking students to go back to class. Because we were young at university, we had paid our school fees all the way, so we didn't understand the meaning of student allowances. We didn't think that was necessary to strike. And lo and behold, police fired at us again in the night. And in my mind's eye, I can still see it's 9 p.m. in the night, and there's an old social science building on the right-hand side as you approach the main hall. In the night, running away from the firing, I fell headlong into a deep ditch, which was left off an unfinished construction site near social science building, and I broke my back. And I would lie in bed for many days. Fate really has a sense of irony. Fate has a sense of irony. Both Noble and Jacob, who were on 2 extreme sides of student politics, would end up on one side of the political spectrum some 16 years later. Jacob joined the movement after his loss in 2006 for the Omoro MP constituency race. He had run that race under a banner, the banner of UPC, which was now severely reduced as a political party. While sadly, Noble, just a year later of Jacob's loss, in May 2007, Noble died, without seeing how this had turned out. That in May, only 5 years later, in May 2001, one of his main protagonists in that 1989-1990 race at university, that Jacob would be the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, of all parties, on an NRM ticket. And 10 years later, he would be the Speaker of Uganda's 11th Parliament. I think those of you who are listening to me, sometimes I become emotional about these things. I suppose in death, these 2 men, one died at 42, one just passed away a few days to his 57th birthday. I assume that these 2 men have met now, not as protagonists, but rather as rekindled souls of smart, intelligent, insightful, discerning, and consensus builders of their generation on earth in our country. I suppose, too, they have embraced. They have given us a strong signal to always work and govern from the middle in order to accommodate each other, because no extremes in life and in public matters are sustainable. Extremists never build anything. Jacob was not an extremist. He was a centrist, and that's why I liked him. I got to know Jacob Oulanyah much better when he married a very fiery friend of mine, a colleague of mine and minister in the Guild government, the late Dorothy Nangwale, herself who had been cut out of the UPC stock. Her father, Engineer Abner Nangwale, had been a Minister for Works in the second Obote government. And Dorothy was a very keen slash and burn debater, no holds barred when she debated too. She was a human rights activist. She was a leader of the National Students Movement. Dorothy and I were both elected in Mbale in September, I think it was September 14th, 1993. We were elected together to lead the student organization, and we began work on setting up the Uganda National Youth Councils. Therefore, I wasn't surprised when Jacob ended with Dorothy as a married couple. They both had this very independent streak. They were very decidedly anti-authority, often very rebellious. They challenged the status quo. They were intellectually excellent to spar with on any issue. They were very firmly confident in their views. They were a couple in every way destined for greatness in their country. I remember Dorothy once came to church one Sunday morning, a few years before her death, and she stood up, holding her baby in her arms. She took to the microphone. She asked the preacher of the day whether it was right, and I quote, to obey government rulers as written in Romans 13, chapter 13, especially if that government was undermining the rights of its citizens. Remember, it's a church service, and she takes to the microphone and she's asking these very political questions. This is because Dorothy was confident that we would take no offense, and that we, particularly me, I would challenge her position both in the spirit and intellectually, given I had background with a couple as my friends for a long time. Both are now gone. Dorothy and Jacob no longer here. But let me not mourn Jacob. There are two things the country will miss about him. And personally, and I guess even the young generation, this will stand out as probably one of his main aspects of his legacy. In the 2016 speakership race, in which he calmly ceded ground for his opponent before the elders of the party, I got in the car and drove to his house and went to see him. I found him very deeply troubled by the talk that he was, quote unquote, less NRM, simply because he had had a UPC background. He told me, and I can paraphrase his quotation, he said, when I make a decision, you must know that I have very well considered all my aspects of an issue, very calmly, very maturely. When I left UPC, I didn't leave any part of me, no shot, no thought, no cell of me remained behind. I left wholeheartedly. I left completely. I had no intention of going into even any other party because I had seen the internal UPC fights that decimated a party that had had a record since 1962. I had noticed how so fundamental at my age at that time to rally behind a strong, smart, a very firm, intellectually superior African leader called Yoweri Museveni. I had noticed that his devotion for Uganda and Africa was unmatchable, close quote. What's the lesson here in this statement that he told me? The lesson is twofold. That those who claim to be the best NRM or from the best NRM pedigree, simply because of the accident of history or position, they are really often the demobilizers of the movement, whether they know it or not. If we had missed Jacob, even for the very short time we had him as a leader in the organization, simply because he came to the party late and we reject him, would Uganda not have missed the contribution of this very illustrious son? The other embedded lesson is that it doesn't matter when people come. It only matters that they come anyway, and that they come with no preconditions, not asking for titles, for money, for this. And that when they do come, you must know they are replenishing the ranks of our leadership, especially if they are good. When they come, they bring fresh experience and insights that the party might not have. Therefore, we must always welcome them with open arms, and we must try their skills and not hold them against their past. This is lesson number one that I will always remember in his legacy, as his legacy. The second thing we will miss Jacob for is his fight to level on ideas, not on pettiness. What are your thoughts? Not where do you come from. That was him. What do you stand for? Not how you look or what you wear. In the 2021 race, he worried very much about the shallow campaign that had more talk about money and less enrichment on what candidates wanted to do when they had the position. Again, I went to see him at his house, and I was very happy to see that in a country where politics has been monetized, it was refreshing to hear someone begin their race with what they wanted to change, not how much they plan to spend. We will miss this original thinker, this level-headed gentleman of our generation. We didn't meet in a bar. We didn't meet in a nightclub. We met at a level of ideas. We opposed each other. We debated each other. We worked together eventually. And he now goes home in peace. May the Lord keep his soul in eternal peace.